Today, I wanted to talk with you just a little bit about George Singleton's Muddling. This story is a little bit longer than what we've read previously, so this video is probably going to be a little bit longer. Um, but I'm not going to go through every single detail. I will kind of cut out some things. But I do want to start by establishing some of the things that are going on at the beginning of this story. Um, we're told in this first paragraph, a guy on the local news said most gas stations lowered their prices at 9 in the morning and raised them at 4. Something about fucking over people who had already driven to work and drivers who didn't leave their cubicle until dusk. He didn't exactly use those words, but any rational cynic knew what he meant. I don't think the guy was an economist or soothsayer, but he evidently worked honestly at something in between, or no one would have interviewed him on Channel 4. So here we learn a couple of things. First of all, we understand kind of this man's mentality, the use of language here. He says any rational cynic would know what he meant, which implies that he, our narrator, is a rational cynic. So a cynic is someone who, you know, doesn't claims to view things as they are. They're not. They're maybe a little bit skeptical. And then the other thing, his use of the word, the way he phrased it is something about fucking people over. Again, we kind of see this cynic side, maybe this cruder side to him. Um, Additionally, he goes on to say, kind of give his opinion. He says, but evidently he worked honestly at something in between, or no one would have ever interviewed him on Channel 4. So he says, he might not be an economist or a soothsayer, but this guy on the news has some credibility. He says, I didn't catch his name or occupation, but he wore a blue shirt and striped tie. He combed his hair. The guy seemed to know more about oil corporations than the rest of my friends, relatives, or instrument needy prospective customers. So we learn a little bit about him. We see that this news reporter knows a little bit about something, and that our narrator is interested in seeing, how smart this guy is. We also get some insight into what our narrator does when he says his instrument needy prospective customers. We see that he clearly sells instruments of some kind. It's not till later that we find out that he's the one who's making what he sells. But because of this sends our narrator on this hunt for the cheapest gas, basically to see if the gas does in fact lower down during the day while people are at work. And so we see in the second paragraph this interesting sentence where he says each establishment sold regular unleaded for $3.65 a gallon plus that 9/10, 20 cents less than the national average. But like my friends, relatives, and instrument needy prospective customers always said, so what? It's still fucking Callistown. Though, again, not in those exact words. So we learned something about where they are. First of all, their gas is cheaper by 20 cents than the national average. So even though gas is expensive, it's cheaper here than it is in other places, which is not uncommon in the South. And then the other thing is he refers to his family, again, friends, relatives, instrument needy prospective customers, in the same way he did in the previous paragraph, which kind of shows us that he lumps them all together regularly. And then we see him refer to their town as fucking Callistown, which is kind of that small town mentality, that if you were raised in a small town, then you kind of discredit that small town and you expect things to be more affordable in a small town because it is a small town and people in small towns typically work blue collar jobs and maybe don't have the money that people in more urban areas or more city like areas where there are more white collar jobs might. So we kind of see this mentality here. Again, this is a guy who in the middle of the day is driving around to check gas prices, which should give us some insight into this community, even though we do find out later that Finley, our narrator, is not too bad off. So we see this drive around. this next paragraph, 365, 365, 365, 365. And he tells us, he starts into this list. Now, I asked you in your discussion questions to consider how Petrick used list in 10 things versus how Singleton uses them in this story. And I think this maybe is a confusing question for you guys, because I don't know that you really picked up on how Singleton used the list. For Petrick, the list was the format for the story. So we went number one, number two, number three, number four, number five, so on and so forth to 10. But with Singleton, he uses lists to give us details so that we understand his thoughts or the scene or the setting or the imagery around him. So let's kind of walk through this. I rounded the block. This is the Columbia Road, over onto Old Callistown Road, onto Charleston Road, onto Old Callistown Road, particular circle. What I'm saying is I circled the heart of the town where supply and demand matter. In between, I noticed 6 or 8 church signs, the funeral home, Southern Exotic Pets, Worms Bar, and so on. Here, he's telling us what he sees, where he is, what he's seeing, and this starts building a picture. Here he's using a list to build a picture. It goes down, he talks about Worms Bar a little bit, and he says one of the churches had a magnetic letter sign out front that read, "Send cooks, fry later," which took me about 16 right-hand turns to figure out, what with cooks being both a verb and noun, and wondering if someone forgot a comma. I thought at least the preacher or signage person isn't making me go to the library 40 miles away, find a Bible, and look up what's spelled out in a particular chapter and verse. So we learn, I point this out to teach us a couple of things here. First, by using this church sign and what it says, we see him contemplating grammar, which suggests that he has an understanding of words, some education perhaps. And then the other thing is we learn that even though he's in this southern town, even though he is this southern man, he's not the typical southern Christian. So we see Singleton with this character already starting to push back on some of these southern stereotypes, even though this is a guy who's living in a small town that has places called Southern Exotic Pets and Worms Bar, and a bunch of churches. We see he's a little bit of an oddball. He's a little bit maybe not fitting in so much. And then we see that, yep, 9 o'clock comes, and sure enough, the gas price falls from 365 to 363. And he says they need to hire that dude on a permanent basis on the TV. The guy who figured out this raise and lower price ruse. I thought, fuck the weatherman, who's never close to being right. This is kind of meant to be funny. This story really is, there's a fair amount of humor in it. And, this idea, yep, this is the guy. He got something right. Those weathermen, they don't get anything right. And Singleton here is kind of picking up on those feelings that all of us have about the weathermen or the weather women, where they're not so accurate. They're far more accurate now than they used to be, but they're making predictions. We then see that he circles around 2 more times and then ultimately chooses to go into Roger Dodgers, who is owned by Roger, who is an Indian man, and he and his wife own this place, and he says he likes to go there. He doesn't mind that they're Indian. He's just kind of happy to be there, and this suggests to us that maybe he's open-minded. We're not really sure. In our next paragraph that starts, I pulled up to the pump. I read, "Please, must pay first, please," on a handwritten sign taped to the pump's torso. And although I wanted to say, oh, fuck me, give me a break. What kind of gas station doesn't have one of those fancy credit debit acceptors, plus a place to slide in cash a la any video poker machines up at Harrah's Casino up in Cherokee? Locked the door to my pickup and started inside. Here we're getting a look into where they are. The Harrah's Casino up in Cherokee. Cherokee is an area of North Carolina, which was home, or still is home, to several Cherokee Native American groups. There's a reservation up there, and they have casinos. So it kind of helps us understand again who this guy is. He's clearly been to these places. Um, and he's also put out by, how this particular place has not moved with the times, and yet he still chooses to be here. Um, and this is the place where we really start to get what's going on here. We see this guy approach him, and he said he's asking if he wants to buy berries. He says, "You need some berries, Chief? Keep away the cancer. Eat them on ice cream or under milk or by themselves. Keep away the cancer. You don't want cancer for you and yours, right?" And we see a different kind of speech pattern taking place with this man, or by themselves, kind of some fragmented sentences, different word choice, and it helps us to understand that this guy is probably not quite as educated as Finley, our narrator, is. He's probably more typical of the Southerner stereotype that we're used to seeing, even if not fully that Southern stereotype. So then we have Finley kind of talk to us as the reader. He's talking to his audience. Remember that I said dusk earlier about people leaving work, which means I'm talking winter. Blackberries emerge in July. No one has local fresh blackberries in November. They have spinach, which fights cancer too, according to spinach farmers, but not blackberries. Hell, I've been around long enough to hear how everything fights cancer. Radishes, peaches, cordwood, getting your driveway sealed. So we hear him kind of. One of the things that's really interesting about this story is that we have the opportunity to get really right in the head of Finley, and we're really following his thoughts. And I think I asked you earlier in your questions about, well, what did you think about this first person narration? And I think this is really where this works so well, because we get this firsthand narration that shows us exactly what he's thinking in his mind. He's telling us the story, and he's telling us what he thinks about things. We see him kind of calling into question how everything fights cancer. We see him rationalizing and reasoning through things like the fact that this man who's approaching him has blackberries that aren't even in season. So where did they come from? So we see him having, we're able to kind of really get into his thoughts and appreciate him. Um, Later on in the story, we get this interaction between Roger and Finley, and Roger calls Finley Mr. Finley, and this is really how we learn Finley's name. And he says, "I had told him not to call me Mr. Finley. Hell, he'd started off greeting me as Finley Sahib. So I guess we had made some progress over the last few years I'd known him. He'd gone from Finley Sahib to Mr. K to Mr. Finley K to Mr. Finley. In a decade, he might plain say, 'Hey, Finley, what's up, bro?' Like any other American. I said, 'Hey, Raj, I need to fill up, or at least I need to get about $70.' So here we kind of see his take on Roger. And again, we're pushing back on those Southern stereotypes because we don't see him treating Roger any differently because he isn't white or isn't um, like him. In fact, he's hoping that eventually Roger will see himself like Finley sees him, which is like any other American. We see him say, I hope he says this like any other American. He sees Roger as just as American as him. And I think that's an important distinction to make here. So then we get into this a couple of paragraphs down where it says, I can't say for sure if Raj Patel suffered from one of those more common forms of short-term memory loss, Korsakoff syndrome, for example, but he found it necessary to explain the nuances of oil company distributor, individual operator every time I walked in, fuel needy or not. If I wasn't busy and didn't have an order to complete back home, I'd hang out with good Raj, look over his various Ganesh pictures and figurines, listen to his weird music, ask about the incense he burned. In time, he'd explain what pathetic profits he received for beer, Little Debbie's, oatmeal pies, charcoal lighter fluid, white bread, daily newspaper, cigarettes, pickle relish, and so on. He must have been some kind of champion oratory forensic declaration contestant back in his Mumbai, Delhi, or Bangalore school days. So we see that Um, it, Finley here is kind of like, oh gosh, he's telling me this again. He must have, he's joking around. He must have, some sort of memory loss. But we also see him paying a compliment to Raj, saying he must have been really good at or speaking or forensics or something because he's so good at this. And we see him really noting something good about Raj here. Again, defying those stereotypes. So then, just a little bit further, we see Raj say, "You are my favorite customer, Mr. Finley." Raj said, "I'd heard him say it to people named Mr. Bubba and Mr. Larry and Miss Darlene and Miss Tiffany when I stood nearly out of earshot at the 12 packs. I started to say, yeah, yeah, but I never see you giving me some lamb sog or whatever it's called. I started to say, I sure could use a little of that good goat vindaloo that we can't get around Callistown." But he chooses not to say this, and this isn't something that he really would say. But it kind of shows where he kind of pictures their relationship. Um, Once he gets back out, we see another use of these lists. As he comes out, he says, "But I couldn't because the Blackberry dude charged in and yelled out, 'I can get you a deal on telephone poles. Who needs some beet sugar? I can get y'all sugar, beans, gourd birdhouses, snow peas, book matches, and rebuilt carburetors. Y'all in need of those things? I got a line of Royal brand typewriters. I got fescue, putters, fog lights, boogie boards, aluminum siding, fire ant killer, and plastic lifelike nativity scenes.' Did I mention telephone poles and blackberries?" Um, and then we see Finley tell us, "I stood there staring at him." Finley's very taken aback by this man who's selling these blackberries. But then we also hear all these other things that this man has, and we're starting to see a picture. This guy clearly is a collector of things, and he sells those things, right? Or at least it seems he does. And we get the understanding that this guy is different, right? He's maybe a little unnerving to Finley. Um, so then he says, we move on down, and he says to Reuben Orr is this guy's name, "You got any ukuleles?" I asked him. If he did, then I knew he'd stolen them from me. So we see immediately that Finlay's like, yeah, skeptical of this guy. Remember, he's a rational cynic. Me, I had gone from being a normal luthier into specializing in ukuleles, an instrument that had some become more sought after than most people believed, probably because of ADD. So we see finally that it is Finley who makes ukuleles and sells them, and he makes custom orders. And we also see kind of this idea of our world now with this upcoming of ADD playing into this. Little guitars, ukuleles, like tiny guitars, Ruben said. I had some sitars a while back, but Roger here bought all them things up. My nephew back home are good sitar players. They are professionals, Raj said. He nodded and didn't blink. One of them is now the #1 steel sitar player in all of India. I said, huh. Handed Raj over 3 20s and 2 5s and walked out to pump my gas before it went back up in price. So it feels like that this is kind of the end of this situation. Um, we've had this kind of weird experience in this gas station. We have our main character really concerned about the cost of gas, but it's not. We're going to see that this is really just the beginning. And then we open up the second section of the story, where now Finley is leaving. He's headed back home. And so he says, I didn't have my camper top attached. I'd only had to put the thing on one time in order to transport 60 custom-made Finley K ukuleles to a group of Hawaiian music enthusiasts who wanted to break some kind of world record in regards to number of people standing waist deep over in Lake Callistown while strumming and singing Tiny Bubbles. So it wasn't difficult to see in my rearview mirror when Mr. Reuben Orr trailing me on his moped. 6'4" or 6'6" on a moped is what I'm saying. I took some turns. There weren't many options. Onto Old Savannah Road, then Old Charlotte Road, then Old Myrtle Beach. And the guy stayed behind me. I thought, fuck. Do I want to waste all this cheap 2 pennies off normal price gas trying to keep a BlackBerry to telephone pole selling moped riding lunatic from perhaps following me back home? Maybe he actually lived on the route I'm taking, I thought. So again, we see some listing here of road names. These road names are important. We have Savannah Road. Savannah's a an old southern city in Georgia. Charlotte, which is one of the larger metro areas in North Carolina. We have Myrtle Beach, which is the most traveled beach in South Carolina. So all showing that kind of southernism, if you will. And we also see Finley like, hey, I'm losing my gas over this guy. Do I really want to try to, lose him, if you will? So he's kind of put out with this whole idea of, oh, I'm, running through this cheap gas I just got. And we see him right here say this, and this is important. I turned left, then right again until I got to the road where I live. So instead of trying to lose Reuben, he says, nope, I'm just going home. Where my ex-wife and I lived until she said out loud that she didn't believe in a ukulele-making husband and took off for Raleigh, North Carolina, where evidently men have jobs that are more secure and less suspect. So it's here that we see, again, some of that defying stereotypes where the wife is looking for maybe more of the normal Southern man, a secure job. But Finley's not that. Still, Reuben Orr's behind him, and he says, I don't know that this has much to do with my story, but I don't believe in the NRA. I mean, I believe the NRA exists, just like I believe the Bible exists, for I've seen it, but I don't believe in those virgin birth, parting of the Red Sea, burning bush, dead guy Lazarus returning, water to wine kind of stories. Anyway, I don't believe that the Second Amendment allows us to carry little pistols around wherever we want for the only purpose of shooting people we fear. No, I believe in taking care of things otherwise. So here we see again a big defying of these traditional Southern stereotypes. He's basically saying, not into the Bible. Oh, also, yep, not a supporter of the Second Amendment in the way that people in the South support it, not for the NRA. He says, I can take care of myself in other ways. So then we get a list of the things that he has. I got out of my truck, reached beneath my seat, and pulled out half a Louisville Slugger. I pulled out nunchucks I didn't know how to use. Further back, I found an old length of a telephone line, maybe 18 inches in length. Notch marks at one end for a better grip. In my pocket, I knew there was a razor-sharp folding buck knife, but that would be my last option. So we get a list of the things he's carrying around to protect himself. So it's not like, oh, I'm anti-violence per se. It's just I'm not pro-gun. Mr. Reuben Orr puttered up behind my truck. He smiled and said, hey, you remember me from Roger Dodgers? What are you doing following me, man? He set his kickstand and turned the ignition. You never let me finish my sentence. I thought you'd be coming back in the station. Anyway, sure enough, I do have a couple of ukuleles back at the trailer. Well, back in one of the filled up trailers. I got to the side of my double wide. I got kerosene lanterns, pup tents, crockery, model cars, and airplanes in the box, alligator heads, a stuffed bobcat, all kinds of shit, and two ukuleles, but I imagine the catgut somewhere between compromised and useless. I said, of course. Well, I sure would like to look at the things. Reuben Orr said, I tell you what, Finley, do you mind if I call you Finley or Finn? Raj told me your name. I tell you what, I'll go home, get the ukuleles, and bring them back over to Roger Dodgers. I shouldn't have left all my blackberries there in the first place. You drop on by later, and I'll have them there waiting for your inspection. I closed my truck door so that Reuben couldn't see my nunchuck sawed-off bat or copper wire and rubber billy club. I said, I got some work to do around here, but I'll come back on and by about after lunch. Sounds good. You got a nice little setup here, he said. Damn, son, you look like you done good for yourself. In a previous life, I said, which was true, seeing as I'd married up. Used to have a rich wife and a regular job. Reuben Orr straddled his moped and turned the ignition. I hear that, he said. He turned the ignition off and on again. Same story as me, except the rich wife and the regular job. He shook his moped, then opened the gas tank lid and peered down close. I said, let me guess. God damn it. This wouldn't have happened if you'd pulled over when I kept buzzing my horn and flashing my lights. Man, I took off following you before I could even fill up at Rogers. You know, they all drop their prices from about 9 in the morning until when people get off work. I seen the thing on that in the news about it. Okay, so we get some back and forth here that's important. First, we learn that Finley's house is nice, and we learn that his wife used to be rich and that he used to have a regular job, which suggests that his desire to make ukuleles or for that to be his primary job might have been part of why things fell apart the way they did. We also see Reuben Orr really wanting to, get more in touch with Finley. He thinks he might be able to sell him something, or that's at least what he's telling us. It turns out that the need to use all of his weapons ended up not being necessary. All right. And then finally, we're out of gas. Reuben's out of gas, and it presents a situation. What are we going to do? Because now Reuben and Finley are together, and they're going to have to figure this out together, right? I had 0 cans of gas in my possession, seeing as I feared my ex-father-in-law showing up, spreading it around, and burning me clear out of the state. Now, this is strange. This suggests that Finley did something, and this is an important detail, that he did something more than just divorcing his ex-wife. Now, the way he's presented it is his ex-wife took off to Raleigh where she could meet, somebody more like who she deserved, if you will. But if her dad's wanting to kill him, burn him up, if he has that kind of, not that he actually wants to do that, but if he has that kind of distaste for Finley, it suggests that maybe Finley has done something bigger or worse than we are aware of. So he says, or my own dousing the place and sitting in the middle of it all, surrounded by custom-made ukuleles that weren't selling like a year earlier. Here we have another revelation that shows us that Finley, if we hadn't picked up on it already, is not exactly happy in his life. So much so that he talks about, yeah, maybe I could just burn myself up. Let's get that thing in the back of my truck and I'll drive you over to Rogers. I don't have gas here and I fear siphoning out my own tank. God damn it, Reuben said. I hate to put you out. He picked the moped up by himself and laid it down on its side. Reuben strode over to the passenger side of the truck where I closed the tailgate. I said, I'm not in a giant hurry today. Hey, what are all those weapons of questionable destruction doing on your bench seat? I couldn't lie. It's a fault. Not being able to lie ruined my marriage. Making and selling ukuleles doesn't require lying, since they are what they are. I dropped out of college first semester junior year because I enrolled in an acting class, and as it ended up, I couldn't conjure up a dialogue outside of the one I owned, or memorize lines I'd never said in a social situation. I said, well, I don't own a gun. I don't own rifles or pistols. So we learn a little bit about Finley that's important here. He can't lie. He tells us he can't lie. He says it's, a fault. He said if he had been able to lie, he might still be married. He said he couldn't make it as an actor because he couldn't, carry off other dialects or remember lines because lying is not who he is. Reuben Orr laughed. He banged his giant hand on his dashboard. I had an old boy hit me upside the head with a 2x4 one time, and I didn't even swerve off the road. I tried to visualize a man getting whacked thusly while straddling a moped. I said, I don't even know how to use nunchucks, to be honest, and backed out onto the road. I got this idea, Reuben said. I don't live far from Roger Dodgers, and I got gas at my own home. I thought a fireplace poker would fit nicely beneath my truck seat. I thought, find a way to ask if he's got fireplace pokers for sale when we get there. Okay, so a couple of things here. Ultimately, Roger's going to, or Reuben's going to get Finley to take him to his house, which is sketchy. And while Finley is clearly doing this, he's willing to do this, his thought is, oh, fireplace poker, that'd be a good weapon to have, which shows us that even though he's not actually saying anything to us yet or to Reuben to suggest that he's afraid, that he's not exactly excited to be taking Reuben to his house, even though that's where Reuben wants to go.